Lonely rancher waited for his mail-order bride, but an armed outlaw woman took her place. Dust swirls at the train depot. A weary rancher waits with hope in his eyes, praying for the woman who might finally end his loneliness. But when the doors swing open, it isn't a gentle bride who steps down. It's a pistol-belted outlaw woman, eyes hard as iron, carrying secrets darker than the storm clouds gathering over the plains. The church bell tolls. Whispers run through the town. Jail keys rattle as the sheriff's deputies close in. She claims she's no thief at all, that she carries proof the railroad has been stealing land from grieving families. But who will believe an outlaw? A rancher torn between law and conscience. A woman branded by scandal but bound to the truth. And a town caught between mercy and judgment. Will he betray her to the noose or risk everything to uncover the truth she hides? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Colorado Rail Depot as Eric Callahan shifted his weight from one polished boot to the other. He ran a finger along his freshly shaved jaw, still unused to the smoothness there after weeks of stubble. The platform boards creaked beneath his feet as he paced, trying to ignore the whispers that followed his every move. Reckon she be pretty as her letter. Mrs. Henderson murmured to her friend, not bothering to lower her voice. Heaven help the poor thing. Living out there all alone with him? Another woman replied. Eric's cheeks burned, but he kept his eyes fixed on the western horizon where the train would appear. The whole town knew his business, how he'd written to a matchmaking service in Boston, how he'd exchanged careful letters with Miss Margaret Porter for 3 months, how today she was meant to arrive and become his wife. The telegraph poles hummed in the evening breeze. Eric touched the folded paper in his coat pocket, her last letter promising she'd wear a blue ribbon so he'd know her. His stomach churned with equal parts hope and terror. 6 years was a long time to be alone. But what if this was a mistake? A distant whistle cut through his thoughts. Smoke appeared on the horizon. Then the thundering shape of the locomotive grew larger. Eric straightened his shoulders and brushed invisible dust from his good coat, the one that had hung unused since Sarah's funeral. The train's brakes screamed against the rails as it shuddered to a stop. Steam billowed across the platform. Eric's heart pounded as passengers began stepping down. He searched for a blue ribbon, for the gentle face he'd imagined while reading those letters. Instead, his gaze caught on a tall woman in a travel-stained skirt who moved with the easy grace of someone used to hard work. Her dark hair was tucked beneath a battered hat, and Eric's breath caught a gun rode low on her hip. This was no Boston lady. Their eyes met across the platform. She walked straight toward him, ignoring the shocked murmurs of the townspeople. Up close, he could see the determination in her sharp features, the wariness in her green eyes. Mr. Callahan. Her voice was low and clear. Eric nodded stiffly. I'm waiting for Miss Porter. Miss Porter won't be coming. The woman's chin lifted. I'm Ella Hayes. We need to talk. The whispers around them grew louder. Eric felt the weight of every stare. Where is she? What's happened? She's safe in Boston. I took her place because I have news that couldn't wait. Ella Hayes glanced at the growing crowd. News best discussed in private. Sheriff Mills stepped forward, hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. Everything all right here, Callahan? Eric looked between the sheriff and this strange woman who'd appended all his careful plans. The proper thing would be to demand answers right here. But something in Ella Hayes' steady gaze made him hesitate. It's fine, Sheriff. Miss Hayes is my guest. Ella's eyebrows rose slightly at the word, but she didn't contradict him. Eric gestured stiffly toward his wagon. This way, he helped her up onto the seat. trying not to notice how different it felt from his imaginings of this moment. Her calloused palm against his. The way she swung up with practiced ease instead of nervous delicacy. Her single carpet bag landed with a suspicious clunk in the wagon bed. Eric climbed up beside her, too aware of the space between them on the wooden seat. The reins felt rough in his suddenly sweating palms. Without looking at the woman beside him, he clucked to his horses. The wagon wheels crunched through the depot's gravel yard. Eric could feel the townsfolk's eyes following them, could already imagine the wild speculation that would race through Colorado Springs by morning. The respectable rancher and the armed stranger, it would feed gossip for months. They rode in tense silence as the town fell away behind them. The setting sun painted the prairie grass gold, while shadows gathered in the draws and hollows. Normally Eric found peace in this hour, watching day fade into dusk. Tonight his thoughts churned like creek water in spring flood. Who was this woman? What news could be so urgent she'd derail his marriage plans? The gun at her hip suggested nothing good. He should turn around, take her straight to the sheriff. Instead, he found himself guiding the horses toward home as the first stars appeared above the mountains. The lamp he'd left burning in the cabin. Window came into view, a lonely yellow eye in the gathering dark. Eric had cleaned every inch of the place that morning, trying to make it welcoming for his bride. Now that same light revealed dust on his boots and worry lines around his mouth as he helped Ella Hayes down from the wagon. She moved like a cat in the dimness, taking in everything with those sharp eyes. Nice spread you've got here. It serves. Eric lit the lantern hanging by the door, studying her in its flickering light. The shadows emphasized the angles of her face, the stubborn set of her jaw. Nothing like the soft-featured woman in the daguerreotype Miss Porter had sent. "I reckon you're wanting explanations," Ella said quietly. Among other things, Eric gestured to the cabin door. "After you, Miss Hayes." She ducked inside, her skirts brushing the threshold. Eric followed, carrying her bag. The weight of it made him frown. What kind of woman traveled with such a heavy carpet bag? The lamp cast dancing shadows on the log walls. Eric had set out his mother's china teacups that morning, dreaming of serving coffee to his new wife. Now they seemed to mock him from their careful arrangement on the shelf. Ella Hayes stood in the middle of his home, taking in the neat bed in the corner, the swept hearth, the Bible on the table. Her expression gave nothing away. "Start talking," Eric said. "Where's Miss Porter? What could be so important you'd interfere with a woman's chance at marriage?" "Miss Porter is exactly where she should be, safe in Boston with her aunt." Ella's voice held an edge of steel. "As for what's important enough to bring me here, ... She reached for her bag. Eric tensed. But she only withdrew a folded paper. "This land deed. Your neighbor Jonas Crawford filed it last month, claiming water rights to Bear Creek. What of it?" "That creek's been common water for 30 years. The deed's a fraud." Ella's eyes flashed. "Just like the one he used to steal my brother's land in Missouri. I've been tracking Crawford's schemes across 3 territories. He bribes officials, forges documents, then forces small ranchers out when they can't water their stock." Eric's mind raced. Jonas Crawford had moved in 6 months ago, buying the old Mackenzie place. He'd seemed friendly enough, if a bit too smooth-talking. But lately there had been talk of new fencing going up along the creek. That's a serious accusation," he said carefully. "I can prove it." Ella spread the deed on the table. "See these ink marks? Crawford uses the same forger every time. I've gathered evidence, statements from other victims. But I need help from someone who knows the territory. Someone honest enough to stand against him in court." Eric studied her face in the lamplight. The wariness was still there, but behind it burned a fierce determination he recognized. The same fire that had driven him to build something from nothing out here on the prairie. "Why me?" He asked quietly. I asked around before coming. Folks say Eric Callahan's word carries weight with judge and jury, that he can't be bought. Her lips curved slightly. They also said you were expecting a bride, which gave me away and past Crawford's men watching the station. The reminder stung. You used me. I did what I had to. No apology in her voice. Crawford's already ruined 3 families back east. I aim to stop him before he does the same here. Eric moved to the window, staring out at the darkness gathering over his land. The land he'd worked so hard to build into something that could support a family. The family that now seemed further away than ever. I need time to think, he said finally. You can have Sarah's old room for tonight. We'll talk more in the morning. Ella nodded, gathering up the deed. Thank you, Mr. Callahan. He showed her to the small room off the main cabin, then returned to sit heavily in his chair by the fire. The lamp flickered, casting his shadow long against the wall. Nothing about this day had gone as planned. His hoped-for bride was still in Boston, and instead he had an armed stranger under his roof with tales of fraud and water rights. Yet as the fire crackled low, Eric couldn't deny the spark of purpose that had ignited in his chest. It had been a long time since anything had stirred him from his quiet routine. Perhaps God had other plans than the ones he'd so carefully laid. Eric stood at his cast-iron stove, stirring the bean and beef stew that had simmered all day. The spoon scraped against the pot's bottom as his thoughts churned like the bubbling broth. Behind him, Ella Hayes sat at his rough-hewn table, her presence as jarring as a hawk among songbirds. Might as well tell me the whole tale, he said, keeping his voice level. About the bride? Miss Porter. The wooden chair creaked as Ella shifted. 3 days ago, I was camping near the stage road when I heard shots. Found the coach under attack, 4 men, faces covered. The driver was already down. Eric turned from the stove, studying her face in the lamplight. Her eyes stayed steady on his. I had a good position up on the ridge, she continued. Got 2 of them with my rifle before they knew where the shots came from. The others fled. She paused, fingers tracing a scratch on the table's surface. Miss Porter was hiding under a seat, shaking like autumn leaves. Poor thing never should have left Boston. Steam rose from the pot as Eric ladled stew into 2 bowls. The familiar scent of sage and beef filled the cabin. Go on. I could tell those men weren't simple robbers. They knew which coach to hit. Had to be Crawford's work. He's done it before. Terrorizing folks who might stand against him. Ella accepted the bowl he offered with a nod of thanks. Miss Porter told me she was headed here to marry. I convinced her to return east while I investigated. Safer for her that way. Convinced her. Eric's spoon clattered against his bowl. Or forced her. I gave her a choice. Ella broke off a piece of cornbread, her movements deliberate. Explained what kind of man Crawford is, how he operates. Said I needed to reach Colorado Springs without drawing attention, and her situation gave me the perfect cover. She agreed to let me take her place temporarily. A faint smile touched her lips. She seemed almost relieved, truth be told. Having second thoughts about marrying a stranger, I expect. Eric pushed his half-empty bowl aside. The stew sat heavy in his stomach. You had no right to interfere. Maybe not. Ella met his gaze squarely. But I couldn't stand by and watch Crawford destroy more lives. Not when I had a chance to stop him. Outside, a coyote's lonely howl drifted across the prairie. Eric rose and walked to the window, where darkness pressed against the glass. The lamp's reflection showed his own weathered face. The worry lines deeper than usual. Double quotes, Mr. Callahan. Ella's voice was quiet but firm. I know I've disrupted your plans. I'm willing to work for my keep until I can move on. I'm good with horses, and I reckon you could use an extra pair of hands around here. Eric turned back to face her. In the lamplight, he could see the earnestness in her expression, mixed with something else. A shadow of old pain, perhaps. The same shadow he sometimes glimpsed in his own mirror. "Lord above," he whispered, more prayer than curse. Was this some divine test? He'd prayed for a wife to ease his loneliness, and instead God had sent him an armed woman with a mission of justice. His late wife Sarah would have laughed at the irony. "1 week," he said finally. "You can stay 1 week while I look into these accusations about Crawford. But there'll be rules." Ella nodded, waiting. "No more deceptions. You'll tell me everything you know about Crawford and these land schemes. And that gun stays holstered unless there's clear danger." "Fair enough." She stood, gathering their bowls. "I'll wash up, then make my bed by the hearth, if that suits." Eric watched as she moved efficiently around his kitchen, her skirts swishing against the plank floor. There was a grace to her movements, despite the gun at her hip and the wariness in her bearing. She reminded him of the wild horses he sometimes spotted in the high meadows, beautiful but untamed, keeping their distance until they decided whether to trust. The dishes done, Ella unrolled her bedding near the banked fire. Eric tried not to notice how she positioned herself with a clear view of both doors. He climbed the ladder to his own loft, the worn rungs familiar under his calloused hands. In the darkness, he could hear her settling below. The floorboards creaked softly as she made one last circuit of the cabin, checking windows and doors. The metallic click of her revolver being set down beside her bedroll seemed unnaturally loud. Eric reached for his own rifle, running his hands over the smooth stock before propping it within easy reach. The gesture felt more habit than necessity tonight. But old instincts died hard on the frontier. Wind rattled the shutters, carrying the coyote's song. In the loft shadows, Eric folded his hands and bowed his head. "Lord," he whispered, "I don't pretend to understand your ways. But if this is your doing, grant me wisdom to see it clear." The only answer was the wind's lonely keening and the soft sound of Ella's breathing below. Two strangers under one roof, neither fully trusting, both seeking something larger than themselves. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and dark under the stars, holding its secrets close. Eric lay back on his bed, listening to the night sounds. The wind, the shutters, the crackle of dying embers. A tenuous peace settled over the cabin, fragile as morning frost. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, an uneasy truce held between the widowed rancher and the woman who had arrived. In place of his bride, morning sunlight spilled across the ranch yard as Eric hitched his team to the wagon. The horses stomped and snorted, their breath visible in the crisp air. He worked methodically, checking each trace and buckle, trying to ignore the tension that had settled over him like a heavy blanket. Ella emerged from the cabin, carrying her own small list of necessities. She wore the same travel-stained skirt but had attempted to tidy her appearance. Her dark hair was neatly braided, though wisps escaped around her face. The gun still rode on her hip. "Ready?" Eric asked, his voice gruff. She nodded, climbing onto the wagon seat with practiced ease. Eric noticed how she positioned herself with clear views of both the road ahead and behind. The leather creaked as he settled beside her. Taking up the reins, they rode in silence for the first mile, the wagon wheels crunching over the packed dirt road. Fields of spring wheat stretched green and promising on either side. A meadowlark song carried on the breeze. "Folks in town," Eric said finally. "They won't take kindly to ... irregularities." Ella's lips quirked in a humorless smile. "You mean they won't take kindly to me? You're not what they're expecting." "No," she agreed quietly. "I rarely am." The town appeared ahead. Buildings rising against the mountains like weathered wooden blocks stacked by a child. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the telegraph wire hummed overhead. Already, Eric could see people pausing in their morning routines. Turning to watch the wagons approach, Mrs. Peterson stood outside the millinery shop, her eyes widening as they passed. She clutched her shawl tighter and hurried inside. Two men lounging outside the saloon straightened, their conversation dying mid-word. "That's no Boston bride." Eric heard someone whisper. "That's Ella Hayes, the outlaw." The words seemed to ripple through the street like wind through prairie grass. Faces appeared in windows. Mothers drew children closer. A group of men outside the barber shop exchanged knowing looks. Eric pulled the wagon to a stop outside Miller's Mercantile. The store's bell jangled as they entered, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Mr. Miller stood behind his counter, spectacles perched on his nose, watching them with undisguised curiosity. "Morning, Eric," he said cautiously. "Heard you were expecting ... company." "Need flour and coffee," Eric replied, ignoring the implied question. "Some sugar, too, if you've got it." Ella moved through the store with deliberate calm, selecting items from her list. The few other customers edged away, creating a bubble of space around her. A woman in a fine dress, the preacher's wife. Mrs. Andrews pressed her lips into a thin line of disapproval. The shop's door opened again. Sheriff Tom Avery filled the doorway, his badge catching the morning light. His hand rested casually near his gun as his gaze fixed on Ella. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet store. "Thought I recognized you? Seem to recall a wanted poster with your face on it. Something about a railroad payroll going missing." Ella turned slowly, facing him. Her hand stayed clear of her weapon, but her spine straightened like steel. "That railroad stole my family's land first, Sheriff. Forged documents, bought off judges. My brother died trying to fight them legally." Her voice was steady, but Eric heard the old pain beneath the words. "I only took back what they'd already stolen from us." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Law is still the law, ma'am. The law." Ella's laugh held no humor. "The law that lets rich men steal poor folks' land. That kind of law?" Tension crackled in the store like heat lightning. Eric moved between them, setting his items on the counter. "Mr. Miller, I'll take these now." The storekeeper hurried to total the purchase, nervous fingers counting out change. The sheriff didn't move from the doorway, his presence a clear warning. A commotion outside drew their attention. A small boy darted past the sheriff, ignoring his mother's call to stop. He ran straight to Ella, wrapping thin arms around her waist. "Miss Ella." The child's face shone with genuine delight. "You came back." Eric recognized him as one of the orphans who lived at the edge of town, Caleb Dawson, whose parents had died in last year's fever epidemic. His little sister Ruthie appeared in the doorway, shy but smiling. Ella's face softened as she knelt to the boy's level. "Hello, Caleb. You've grown. Remember when you shared your bread with us?" Caleb asked. "During the cold time, and told us stories about the stars." "Of course I remember." Ella's voice grew gentle. "How's your sister?" "Better now. We got a place to sleep at Widow Jensen's sometimes." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "But we still miss your stories." Mrs. Andrews made a small sound of surprise, her expression wavering between judgment and confusion. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, his certainty visibly shaken by this display of affection from the town's most vulnerable children. Eric watched the scene unfold, something warming in his chest despite his better judgment. He saw how naturally Ella spoke with the children, the genuine concern in her eyes as she asked about their welfare. It was hard to reconcile this tender interaction with the hardened outlaw everyone claimed her to be. "Time to go," he said quietly, gathering their purchases. Ella nodded, giving Caleb's shoulder a final squeeze. "You be good now," she told the boy. "Look after your sister." The sheriff stepped aside to let them pass, but his warning was clear. "I'll be watching, Miss Hayes." Outside, the morning had grown warmer. Dust motes danced in the sunlight as Eric loaded the supplies into the wagon. Ella climbed up beside him, her movements more weary now. The children waved from the boardwalk until they turned onto the road home. They rode in silence again. But it felt different now. The tension had shifted, become more complex. Eric found himself stealing glances at his companion, seeing her through new eyes. He'd witnessed both condemnation and compassion in town, and neither seemed to tell the whole truth about Ella Hayes. Dust billowed behind the wagon as they headed home. The road stretched before them, empty except for a lone hawk circling overhead. Eric thought about the morning's events, the sheriff's suspicion, the preacher's wife's disapproval, and most of all, the pure joy on that orphan boy's face when he saw Ella. The truth, he was beginning to realize, was rarely as simple as wanted posters made it seem. His grip tightened on the reins as he considered his position, harboring a known outlaw, risking his own reputation in the process. Yet he couldn't forget how she'd knelt to comfort those children, or the pain in her voice when she spoke of her brother's death. The wagon rolled on toward home, each turn of the wheels carrying them further from town, but not from the morning's revelations. Dust swirled in their wake like the questions spinning in Eric's mind, offering no easy answers. The morning sun painted the eastern sky in pale gold when Eric stepped onto his front porch. He'd risen early, as was his habit, but the sound of someone moving about the yard had pulled him from his morning coffee. To his surprise, Ella was already outside, scattering feed to the chickens that clustered eagerly around her boots. She wore a faded work dress, her dark hair tied back with a strip of cloth. The morning light caught the determined set of her jaw as she worked, revealing a woman far different from the dangerous stranger who'd arrived at the depot. The chickens seemed to sense it too, following her movements with comfortable familiarity. Eric watched, coffee cup cooling in his hand, as she finished with the chickens and moved on to other morning chores. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years learning to make every movement count. No wasted steps, no hesitation. A commotion from the south pasture drew their attention. One of the younger calves had slipped through a gap in the fence and was heading toward open range. Eric set down his cup, ready to saddle his horse, but Ella was already moving. She grabbed a coiled rope from the fence post and broke into a run. Her movements were fluid as she approached the calf, speaking low and steady to keep from spooking it. The rope whistled through the air, settling perfectly around the calf's neck. With practiced skill, she guided the animal back toward the fence, maintaining just enough tension to direct without frightening. Eric found himself nodding in approval. He'd seen seasoned ranch hands handle similar situations with less grace. When Ella led the calf back through the repaired fence gap, he offered a gruff acknowledgement. "That was well done. Had plenty of practice," she replied, coiling the rope with careful precision. Can't afford to lose stock when you're running a small spread. Over the next few days, Eric found himself repeatedly surprised by Ella's capabilities. She attacked every task with the same quiet determination she'd shown that first morning. The woodpile grew steadily under her axe. The leather tack was mended with neat, strong stitches. And the house itself seemed to breathe easier with her attention. Most unexpected was her singing. It would drift across the yard while she worked old hymns and trail songs, her voice clear and unpretentious. The melody stirred something in Eric's memory, reminding him of peaceful evenings from before, when Sarah had been alive and the house had known more than silence. One evening, as they sat down to a supper of beans and cornbread, Eric found himself speaking what had been on his mind. "You work harder than most hands I've hired." He studied her across the table, noting how the lamplight softened the wariness in her features. "And truth be told, do a better job of it." Ella paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Survival's a good teacher," she said finally. "When you're on your own, you learn quick that idle hands mean an empty belly." She resumed eating, but her next words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Besides, work helps quiet the mind. Keeps old troubles from taking root. Eric understood that sentiment all too well. He'd thrown himself into ranch work after Sarah's death, letting physical exhaustion dull the sharper edges of grief. Before he could respond, hoofbeats approached the house. A young man on horseback appeared in the yard, the courier's bag at his saddle, marking him as one of the agency's riders. Eric met him at the door, accepting a letter sealed with official wax. His stomach tightened as he recognized the land office's mark. "Much obliged," he told the rider, who touched his hat and turned his horse back toward town down inside. Ella had already begun clearing the dishes, but her attention was focused on the letter in Eric's hand. He broke the seal, unfolding the paper with fingers that weren't quite steady. The contents were exactly what he'd feared, a reminder of overdue land taxes. With barely veiled threats about the consequences of continued delay, Eric sank heavily into his chair, the paper rough against his calloused fingers. The drought 2 years ago had started the spiral, and Sarah's medical bills had drained what little they'd managed to save. He'd been juggling debt ever since, trying to keep the ranch afloat while the taxes mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. The scrape of Ella's chair brought him back to the present. She'd finished with the dishes and now stood by the fireplace, her face thoughtful in the fading light. "Bad news. Land office," he admitted. "Taxes coming due." He didn't elaborate, but the weight in his voice said enough. Ella nodded, understanding clear in her expression. "Government men," she said softly, "always wanting their share, whether folks can spare it or not." There was an old bitterness in her words, echoing her story about the railroad and her brother's land. Eric folded the letter carefully, trying to calculate impossible sums in his head. The ranch demanded constant attention, fences to mend, cattle to tend, crops to plant and harvest. He couldn't afford to hire help, but neither could he manage it all alone. And now, with a wanted woman under his roof, the complications only multiplied. Yet as he watched Ella move about the kitchen, setting things to rights with quiet competence, he felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. She hummed softly as she worked, some old song about coming home. The sound filled the room like evening sunlight, making the familiar space feel less empty. It had been 3 years since Sarah's death, 3 years of silence and solitude. He'd thought those parts of himself, the parts that notice such things as a woman's voice or the grace of her movements, had died with his wife. But watching Ella's strong hands, gentle with dishes, hearing her soft singing, he felt something stir that he'd believed long buried. The realization brought both comfort and concern. He couldn't afford distractions, not with the ranch's future so uncertain. And Ella Hayes carried danger in her wake, no matter how capable her hands or kind her heart toward orphan children. The evening deepened around them, shadows growing long on the walls. Ella finished her tasks and bid him good night, spreading her bedroll near the hearth, as had become her habit. Eric remained at the table, the tax notice heavy in his pocket. Watching as she settled for the night, in just a few days, she'd transformed from unwelcome intruder to essential help. Her presence had begun to feel natural, as if she'd always been part of the ranch's rhythm. That thought both alarmed and comforted him, much like the unfamiliar warmth he felt watching her brush out her dark hair in the FIRELIGHT outside. A coyote called to its mate, the sound carrying clear across the evening air. Inside, the fire crackled low, and Ella's steady breathing joined the familiar night sounds of the ranch. Eric finally rose from the table, his troubled thoughts turning toward tomorrow's work and the growing complexity of his situation. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the Colorado sun painting the ranch house in shades of gold. Eric stood before his cracked mirror, straightening his string tie with fingers that hadn't performed this ritual in months. He'd avoided church since Sarah's death, finding more comfort in solitary prayer than communal worship. But today was different. "Miss Hayes," he called, his voice carrying through the house. "We'll be attending service this morning. Ella appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her plainest skirt and a faded blue blouse. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and Eric noticed she'd left her gun belt hanging by the door, a silent acknowledgement of sacred space. "Reckon that's wise." She asked quietly, "Might be easier on you if I stayed here." Eric shook his head, settling his good hat firmly. "Running from gossip only feeds it. Besides," he added, checking his pocket watch, "the good book says where 2 or 3 gather in his name." The wagon wheels creaked, familiar rhythm as they made their way into town. Ella sat straight beside him, her hands folded in her lap, face composed despite the tension Eric could sense in her shoulders. The morning air carried the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth while ahead. The white-painted church stood stark against the blue sky. Other wagons and riders converged on the simple building, dust rising from wheels and hooves. As Eric helped Ella down from the wagon, the usual Sunday morning greetings died away. Whispers rippled through the gathering crowd like wind through prairie grass. Inside the one-room church, sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Eric led the way to a pew near the back, conscious of heads turning, conversations faltering. Ella followed with quiet dignity. Though her fingers twisted the worn hymnal she'd picked up, Reverend Matthews stood at his rough-hewn pulpit, his weathered face carefully neutral as he surveyed his congregation. When he began to speak, his chosen text seemed pointed. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." Throughout the sermon, the preacher's eyes flickered repeatedly toward their pew. He spoke of judgment, of the danger of casting stones, of the need for understanding hearts. Eric found himself shifting uncomfortably, recognizing the careful dance between rebuke and reminder. When it came time for hymns, the first notes from the wheezy organ filled the space. Ella opened her hymnal, and as Amazing Grace began, her voice rose clear and true above the uncertain mumble of the congregation. The pure, sweet sound caught everyone by surprise. Even the fidgeting children turned to stare. Her voice carried no shame, no hesitation, just the simple beauty of praise. Eric found himself struck silent, watching her profile as she sang words of redemption with such quiet conviction. For a moment, the whispers stilled, replaced by something like wonder. But the spell broke as soon as the final amen faded. As the congregation filed out into the Sunday morning sunshine, the barriers went up again. A cluster of widows gathered near the steps, their dark dresses like a murder of crows, their whispered words sharp as beaks. The nerve of her, coming to God's house, ... double quotes, poor Eric Callahan. What can he be thinking, ... and her singing like that, as if she had the right, ... A young mother hurriedly pulled her curious daughter away as Ella passed, as if outlawry might be catching. The child's confused protest, "But Mama, she sings like an angel," carried clearly in the morning air. Eric's jaw tightened as he helped Ella back into the wagon. The reins felt rough in his suddenly tense grip as they pulled away from the church, leaving the whispers and stares behind. The way home seemed longer, weighted by unspoken thoughts. Finally, as the ranch house came into view, Eric broke the heavy silence. "Your being here," he said carefully, "it makes things complicated." Ella's hands remained folded in her lap, her voice soft but steady when she replied, "I never asked to stay, Mr. Callahan, and I won't overstay my welcome." She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "But I won't run from truth, either. Running never solved anything. I learned that lesson too late to help my brother, but I learned it well." The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Ella disappeared into the barn to tend to evening chores, while Eric sat on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. Her words echoed in his mind, mingling with the memory of her voice raised in praise. Unfettered by the judgment surrounding her, when darkness fell, they sat down to their simple supper of beans and cornbread. The lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls, and the familiar evening sounds of the ranch drifted in through the open window. Cattle lowing softly. Crickets beginning their night song. Eric looked at the woman across from him, this unexpected guest who had appended his careful plans, yet proved herself daily with honest work and quiet strength. Something shifted in his heart, like a door long rusted shut beginning to creak open. Without warning, he bowed his head. "Lord," he began, his voice rough with disuse, but growing stronger, "we thank you for this food and for your mercy that finds us even when we lose our way." He paused, swallowing hard. "Help us to see with your eyes, to judge with your heart, and to trust your guidance even when the path ahead seems unclear. Amen." When he looked up, Ela was watching him with gentle surprise. It was the first time he'd prayed aloud since Sarah's death. The first time he'd acknowledged that still, small voice that had been whispering to his heart these past days. The beans in their tin bowls steamed gently, and outside a whippoorwill called into the gathering night. Neither spoke for a long moment, letting the simple prayer settle around them like a blessing. The Wednesday sun beat down mercilessly as Eric and Ella worked on the barn's aging roof. Weathered shingles lay scattered around them like fallen leaves, their edges curled from years of rain and snow. The sound of hammering echoed across the ranch yard, punctuated by the distant lowing of cattle. Eric wiped sweat from his brow, watching Ella expertly nail down another row of fresh shingles. She'd proved as skilled with repairs as she was with ranch work, handling tools with the same quiet confidence she brought to everything else. "Pass me those nails," she said, reaching out without looking up from her work. The sleeve of her work shirt slipped back, revealing a thin scar on her forearm. Eric handed over the tin can of nails, noticing how her fingers trembled slightly. She'd been distracted all morning, her usual focus scattered like chaff in the wind. Something was weighing on her mind, showing in the tight set of her shoulders and the way she'd barely touched her breakfast. "Reckon we should break for water soon?" he suggested. Squinting at the sun directly overhead, Ella sat back on her heels, pushing loose strands of dark hair from her face. "Mr. Callahan," she said slowly, "there's something I need to show you." Her voice carried an edge of decision. As if she'd finally worked up the courage for something long planned, she made her way carefully across the roof to where her saddlebag lay propped against the chimney. The leather was worn smooth with age and travel, its brass buckles dulled by weather. With careful movements, she reached inside and withdrew a folded paper, protected by a scrap of oilcloth. "This is why the railroad men want me," she said quietly, holding the document as if it might crumble in her hands. "This is why I can't just disappear into the hills. Much as the sheriff might wish I would." Eric set down his hammer, giving her his full attention. The air seemed to still around them, heavy with more than just the midday heat. Ella unfolded the paper with reverent care. The creases were worn white, speaking of countless readings. "It's my brother Matthew's deed," she explained, her voice catching slightly on the name. "To our valley spring. 10 acres of the sweetest water in all of Missouri." Eric leaned closer, studying the careful handwriting and official seals. The document was genuine. He'd seen enough land papers to recognize the real thing. The signatures at the bottom carried the weight of law and promise. "Railroad wants that spring," Ella continued, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. "Their new line needs water for the steam engines, and our valley sits right where they want to build." Matthew refused to sell. She swallowed hard. He was just 22, but he understood what that water meant to our neighbors, to the whole valley. A cloud passed over the sun, casting brief shadow across the roof where they sat. Below, a chicken scratched in the dust, clucking softly to her chicks. "What happened?" Eric asked gently, though part of him already knew. He'd seen too many small farmers lose everything to progress and profit. "Corrupt surveyors," Ella said, bitterness seeping into her voice. declared our land abandoned while Matthew was down with fever. By the time he recovered, railroad men were already measuring the spring. Her hands clenched around the deed. We tried fighting it, legal-like first. But lawyers cost money we didn't have. Understanding dawned in Eric's mind. The payroll robbery. Ella nodded, meeting his eyes steadily. Took what they'd stolen from us and more besides. Meant to use it to hire the best lawyer in St. Louis. A sad smile touched her lips. Instead, I got branded an outlaw and Matthew. ... She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Eric could read the loss in every line of her face. Let's get down from this roof, he said quietly. This needs proper looking at. They made their way carefully down the ladder, gathering their tools. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Inside the house, Eric lit the lamp despite the daylight. Wanting to study the deed properly, the lamplight cast a warm glow over the kitchen table as he spread out the document. His fingers traced the official seals, the careful signatures. Everything about it spoke of legitimacy. This was no forgery, but a true claim to the land. Sheriff Avery won't care about this, Ella said from where she stood by the window. Her arms wrapped around herself as if warding off a chill despite the warm day. He's got his orders. Won't stop until he sees me hang. Eric studied the deed for a long moment more, mind working through what he knew of law and justice. Finally, he folded it carefully. The crisp creases a sharp contrast to its worn state. This changes things, he said, placing it back in her saddlebag with deliberate care. The leather was warm from sitting in the sun, and he could feel the weight of other papers inside. Letters, perhaps, or more evidence of her brother's claim. I never meant to bring trouble to your door, Ella said softly. You've been kind, offering shelter to a stranger. Kinder still, not asking questions when you knew something wasn't right. She moved away from the window, her skirts brushing against the rough floorboards. But this fight's bigger than me now, and I won't blame you for wanting no part of it. Eric looked around his kitchen at the simple furnishings, the familiar tools of his daily life. Everything here spoke of the quiet existence he'd built since Sarah's death. A life of routine and respectability, far from controversy or conflict. But now that peace had been broken by truth. His ranch, his reputation, even his slowly reawakening faith, all were tangled up in something larger than himself. A battle between justice and power. Between what was legal and what was right. The deed lay in Ella's saddlebag like a burning coal, its presence changing everything. This wasn't just about offering shelter to a woman in need anymore. This was about standing up against the kind of corruption that destroyed lives and stole futures. Evening, lights slanted through the windows, painting patterns on the wall. Outside, the ranch continued its usual rhythm, horses nickering in the barn, wind rustling through the cottonwoods. But inside, the air hung heavy with the weight of decision and consequence. Eric carefully buckled the saddlebag closed, each movement measured and deliberate. The familiar sounds of his ranch seemed somehow different now, as if they too were wrapped up in this larger story of justice and redemption. They sat in silence as darkness gathered, outside the windows, each lost in thought about what tomorrow might bring. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the ranch house that had suddenly become both fortress and battleground in a fight for what was right. Morning sunlight spilled across the ranch yard as Eric finished his coffee on the porch. The day promised to be clear and warm, perfect for mending the south fence line. He had just set down his cup when he spotted 3 riders approaching through the early haze. His stomach tightened. Sheriff Avery's broad-brimmed hat was unmistakable, even at a distance. 2 deputies flanked him, their badges glinting in the morning light. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as they approached. Stirring up clouds of dust from the dry earth, Eric stood slowly, hooking his thumbs in his belt. Behind him, the screen door creaked as Ella stepped out. Her footsteps light on the wooden boards. "Stay inside," he murmured, but she remained where she was, just behind his shoulder. The riders pulled up in front of the porch, their horses stamping restlessly. Sheriff Avery's mount, a big bay gelding, tossed its head as he reined it in. The sheriff's weathered face was set in hard lines as he looked down at Eric. "Morning, Callahan," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes slid past Eric to where Ella stood. "Miss Hayes." Sheriff Eric replied evenly. "What brings you out so early?" Avery shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "Got something that needs saying, and I aim to say it plain." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper. "This here's a wanted notice. Been hanging in the post office since yesterday." He held it out, and Eric had to step forward to take it. The paper was crisp, official-looking, with Ella's name spelled out in bold letters. The charges were listed below: theft, armed robbery, resisting arrest, $500 reward. The sheriff added meaningfully, "Dead or alive." Eric's jaw tightened as he read. Behind him, he heard Ella's soft intake of breath. "You're making a mistake," he said. Looking up at Avery, "She's no danger to anyone." The sheriff's face hardened. "What she is a fugitive from the law. And you, Callahan?" He leaned forward in his saddle. "You're harboring her. That makes you just as guilty in the eyes of the law. The law isn't always right." Ella's voice rang out clear and strong as she stepped forward. Her chin was lifted, eyes blazing. "Sometimes it's just a tool for those with money to steal from those without." That's mighty bold talk from someone facing the gallows, one of the deputies. Sneered. Ella's hand twitched toward where her gun usually rode. But today, her hip was empty. She had taken to leaving it inside, knowing how it worried Eric when she wore it in plain sight. "You want to arrest me, Sheriff?" she challenged. "Then show me your proof. Show me witnesses who'll swear they saw me rob that train. Show me the money you claim I took." Sheriff Avery's face darkened. "Judge Williams arrives next week for circuit court. He'll sort this out quick enough." He straightened in his saddle, gathering his reins. "Until then, Callahan, think hard about where your loyalties lie. Town's got a long memory for those who side against the law." The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Eric stood his ground, meeting the sheriff's gaze steadily. "I reckon a man's got to side with what's right, Sheriff. Law or no law." Avery's lips thinned. Without another word, he wheeled his horse around. The deputies followed, and soon all three were galloping away, leaving only dust clouds and tension in their wake. Eric and Ella stood watching until the riders disappeared over the rise. Finally, she spoke softly. "You shouldn't have done that." He turned to look at her. The morning sun caught the worried lines around her eyes, the way her hands were clasped tight together. "Done what?" "Stood up to him. Chosen my side." She shook her head. "This isn't your fight, Eric." "Maybe it is now," he replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. He looked down at the wanted poster still clutched in his hand, then deliberately tore it in half. They spent the rest of the day working in tense silence. Eric split wood until his arms ached, each swing of the axe helping to work out his frustration. Ella cleaned the house from top to bottom, as if trying to scrub away her own worried thoughts. Night fell slowly, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. After a quiet supper, Eric retired to his room, but sleep proved elusive. When it finally came, his dreams were filled with familiar voices and faces long missed. Sarah stood before him, as real as the day he'd lost her. Her blue dress moved in a breeze he couldn't feel, her kind eyes fixed on his face. "You always did know right from wrong, Eric," she said softly. even when knowing costs you something. "I miss you," he told her, his heart aching. "I wish you were here to tell me what to do." She smiled, the same gentle smile that had first won his heart. "Protect the innocent," she said simply. "Like you always have." He woke before dawn, Sarah's words still echoing in his mind. The house was silent, except for the faint creaking of timbers and the distant call of a night bird. Through his window, he could see stars scattered across the dark sky like grains of salt on black cloth. Eric lay there, troubled but strangely peaceful. Sarah was right. He'd always known the difference between what was legal and what was right. Sometimes they were the same thing, but not always. Not this time. The wanted poster's torn pieces still lay on his bureau, a reminder of the choice he'd already made. Whatever came next, he knew he couldn't turn Ella away. Not just because she was innocent of the worst charges, but because protecting her was the right thing to do. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when he finally rose. Below his window, he could see Ella already up and moving around the barn, feeding the horses as if it were any ordinary morning. But they both knew nothing was ordinary anymore. The sheriff's visit had changed everything, forcing them both to face what they'd been avoiding. Eric dressed slowly, each movement deliberate as he considered what lay ahead. The judge would arrive soon, bringing with him the full weight of the law. But until then, they had time to think, to plan, to decide what justice really meant in a world where power too often masqueraded as right. He thought again of Sarah's words in his dream. Protect the innocent. The path ahead might be difficult, might cost him more than he was ready to give. But at least he knew which direction to take. Sometimes, that was all a man could ask for. Thunder rolled in the distance as Eric worked in the barn that afternoon, the air heavy with coming rain. Through the wide doors, he could see Ella hanging wash on the line, hurrying to get the clothes dry before the storm hit. Her movements were quick and sure. Sheets snapping in the rising wind. A sound caught his attention, small boots scuffing on the packed earth. Two children stood at the barn entrance, their clothes threadbare but clean. Eric recognized them immediately. Caleb and Ruthie Dawson, orphaned just last winter when fever took their parents. They had been staying with different neighbors since then, passed from home to home as charity allowed. Caleb, the older one at 10 years old, held his sister's hand tight. 7-year-old Ruthie's eyes were wide and anxious, her free hand clutching at her worn dress. "Mr. Callahan," Caleb said, straightening his thin shoulders. "We were wondering, ... double quotes," he faltered, pride warring with hunger on his young face. "When's the last time you two ate?" Eric asked gently, setting down his tools. Before Caleb could answer, Ella appeared in the doorway behind them, laundry basket propped on her hip. Her expression softened as she took in the children's worn shoes and hollow cheeks. "Well now," she said warmly. "Looks like I've got company for my afternoon bread and jam." She set the basket down and knelt to Ruthie's level. "Would you like that, sweetheart?" Ruthie nodded shyly, while Caleb's stance remained wary. Eric watched as Ella guided them toward the house, her hand light on Ruthie's shoulder. The girl was already leaning into her touch, starved for more than just food. Inside, Ella settled the children at the kitchen table. Eric followed, leaning in the doorway as she cut thick slices of fresh bread and spread them with apple preserves. When she set the plates before them, she cut her own portion in half and added it to their shares. "Now then," she said, pulling up a chair. "Did I ever tell you about the time I helped my little brother catch a raccoon that had been stealing our corn?" The children shook their heads, bread already half gone. Ruthie had jam on her chin, and Caleb was trying not to look like he was hurrying, though his fingers trembled slightly as he ate. "Well," Ella continued, her voice taking on a storyteller's lilt. "Jimmy, that was my brother. He was about your age." "Caleb, We set up near the corn patch one evening with a piece of shiny tin, ... The story unfolded, drawing smiles from both children. Even Eric found himself chuckling at her description of Jimmy covered in mud, the raccoon having led them on a merry chase through the creek. As she talked, she quietly added more bread to their plates, making sure they had their fill. Rain began to patter against the windows, but inside the kitchen was warm and bright. Ruthie had edged her chair closer to Ella's while Caleb's shoulders had finally relaxed. Ella moved smoothly from one tail to another, speaking of her childhood on a small Missouri farm, helping her mother gather eggs, learning to ride her father's old mare, watching storms roll in across the wheat fields. My mama used to say that thunder was just the angels moving their furniture around, she told them, as a particularly loud crack shook the house. Ruthie jumped, and without hesitation, Ella opened her arms. The little girl climbed into her lap, burying her face in Ella's shoulder. Eric's chest tightened at the sight. He remembered Sarah doing the same with neighbor children, her natural motherly warmth drawing them close. But watching Ella now, one arm around Ruthie, her other hand reaching out to squeeze Caleb's shoulder, reassuringly, he saw something deeper than mere kindness. Here was a woman who had lost her own family, yet still had so much love to give. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof. "You two better stay until this passes," Eric said. "No sense getting soaked through." Ella smiled at him over Ruthie's head, grateful. "How about we make some paper boats while we wait?" she suggested. "I'll show you how to fold them just right, and when the rain makes puddles, you can sail them." The next hour passed in peaceful industry. Ella taught them to crease and fold paper into little boats, her fingers patient as she guided theirs through each step. The children's laughter mixed with the storm's rhythm, filling the house with sounds Eric had almost forgotten. When the rain finally slackened, Ella wrapped the remaining bread and tucked it into Caleb's pocket. "For later," she said softly, straightening his collar. "You come back if you need more, you hear?" Ruthie hugged her tight, and even Caleb allowed a quick embrace before they headed out, clutching their paper boats. Eric and Ella stood on the porch, watching until the children disappeared around the bend in the road. The storm had cleared by evening, leaving behind that peculiar golden light that sometimes follows rain. Eric built up the hearth fire while Ella made coffee, the familiar routine somehow different tonight. When she handed him his cup, their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away quite as quickly as they might have before. They settled in their usual chairs, the fire crackling softly. Steam rose from their cups, carrying the rich scent of coffee through the room. Outside, water dripped steadily from the eaves. "The ranch feels different lately," Eric said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "More alive, I reckon." Ella studied her coffee, a small smile playing at her lips. "Those children deserve better than drifting between neighbors' charity." "They do," he agreed. "Seems to me they took to you right quick." "Children know who they can trust," she said quietly. "They've got a sense about people that grown folks sometimes lose." She paused, then added, "I miss that about my brother, how clearly he saw things." Right up until the end, Eric watched the firelight play across her face, seeing both strength and sorrow there. Despite the wanted poster in town, despite the sheriff's threats hanging over them, she had split her bread without hesitation, given comfort freely, even knowing it might be snatched away. The rain started up again, softer now, tapping against the shutters like gentle fingers. In his mind, Eric could still hear the children's laughter, could see Ruthie's complete trust as she curled in Ella's lap. It stirred something in him, not just memories of Sarah, but something new. Something that felt like hope. He had been so long without it, he had almost forgotten its shape. But here it was, warming him more surely than the fire, despite all the danger that still lay ahead. Despite the judge coming, despite what the town might think. Here in this room, with rain on the roof and coffee in his cup, Eric felt closer to peace than he had in years. Ella's quiet voice broke into his thoughts. "Penny, for your thoughts." He looked at her, really looked, saw the kindness in her eyes, the gentle curve of her smile, the strength in her bearing. "Just thinking that some things are worth the risk," he said softly. She held his gaze for a long moment, understanding passing between them. Then she nodded, turning back to watch the fire. But her smile remained, soft and real in the gathering dark. 3 days of peace had settled over the ranch like fresh snow, unmarred by trouble. Eric stood at the corral fence, watching Ella curry his bay mare. Her sure strokes with the brush showed the same care she had given the orphans. The morning sun caught golden glints in her dark hair, and he found himself studying the way she moved. Graceful. Despite her worn dress, the clatter of wheels shattered the quiet. A polished carriage rolled up the drive, looking out of place against the ranch's weathered buildings. The horses' brass fittings gleamed, their hooves kicking up dust that settled on their fine leather harness. Eric straightened, tension crawling up his spine. Beside him, Ella went still, her hand tightening on the curry brush. A man in an Eastern-cut suit stepped down from the carriage. His boots were city-made, barely dusty despite the drive. Everything about him spoke of money and influence, from his silk vest to his gold watch chain. Mr. Callahan. The man's smile was practiced, smooth as creek ice. Harlan Fitch, representing the Western Pacific Railroad Company. He extended a manicured hand. Eric took it briefly, noting the soft palm. "What brings railroad business out this way?" Fitch's gaze slid past him to Ella, who had moved closer, still holding the curry brush like a shield. "Ah, Miss Hayes. I thought we might find you here." His tone hardened beneath its polish. "You have something that belongs to us." "The deed belongs to my brother's memory," Ella said, her voice steady despite the pallor that had crept into her face. "And to the truth, the truth." Fitch's laugh held no humor. "The truth is, that land was properly surveyed and claimed by the railroad. Your brother's death was unfortunate, but it changes nothing." Eric stepped between them, his shadow falling across Fitch's polished boots. "You're not welcome here. Come now, Mr. Callahan." Fitch reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "Let's be reasonable. The railroad is prepared to compensate you generously for your cooperation. $500, cash in hand. For surrendering the fugitive and the document she stole, the amount would cover Eric's back taxes twice over." He felt Ella go rigid behind him, waiting for his answer. "Get off my land," Eric said quietly. Fitch's smile thinned. "Consider carefully, sir. You're harboring a known criminal. That makes you liable under the law. The sheriff already has his eye on this situation." He tapped the envelope against his palm. "Why sacrifice everything for a woman you barely know? For a deed that means nothing to you?" "I know enough," Eric replied. "I know right from wrong, as you wish." Fitch tucked the envelope away. "But remember, you chose this path." He turned back to his carriage, then paused. "Miss Hayes, your brother died alone in the dirt, defending worthless scrubland. Don't make the same mistake." Eric's fists clenched, but Ella's hand on his arm held him back. They watched in silence as the carriage rolled away, dust settling in its wake. When the sound of wheels had faded, Ella's composure cracked. She pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sound between a sob and a laugh. "Jimmy wasn't alone," she whispered. "I was there. I held him while he died." Eric turned to her, seeing the raw grief in her eyes. She hadn't spoken of her brother's death before, kept that wound buried deep. "Tell me," he said gently. They walked to the porch steps and sat. The curry brush lay forgotten in the dust. In the distance, a meadowlark called, sweet notes a counterpoint to Ella's quiet voice. "The spring on our land was everything," she began. Without it, the whole valley goes dry by August. The railroad wanted it for their steam engines. When Jimmy wouldn't sell, they sent men with torches one night. Burned our barn. Her fingers twisted in her skirt. Next morning, the surveyor showed up, claiming the land was abandoned. Jimmy tried to stop them from marking new boundaries. One of them shot him. She took a shuddering breath. I was running from the house when I heard the gun. Found him by the spring he died protecting. The deed was in his shirt pocket, still sealed with the land office stamp. His blood, ... double quotes, she stopped, swallowing hard. His blood stained the corner of it. Eric covered her trembling hands with his own. Her fingers were calloused from work, but still smaller than his. Still bearing the shape of the life she'd lost. The law wouldn't listen, she continued. The railroad owned the judges. So I took matters into my own hands. Robbed their payroll to hire honest lawyers to keep fighting. But they branded me an outlaw instead. The deed is all I have left of him now. His dream of building something lasting, of doing right by the land. She looked up at Eric, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I won't let them take that too. They won't, Eric said firmly. I promise you that. She studied his face. Why? Why risk everything for a stranger's cause? Because it's right, he said simply. And because you're not a stranger anymore, the truth of it settled between them like evening quiet. The sun was sinking now, painting the ranch in soft gold. Eric built up the fire while Ella made coffee, their movements in harmony after weeks of shared routine. They sat close to the hearth, the flames casting flickering shadows. Neither spoke for a long while, letting the weight of the day settle. Outside, a lone wolf called from the distant hills, its voice carrying clear and wild through the gathering dark. Eric felt Ella shiver slightly beside him. Without thinking, he shifted closer, offering warmth and presence. She didn't pull away. What Fitch said about the sheriff, she murmured. He'll come eventually. Let him come, Eric replied. We'll face it together. She turned to look at him, firelight dancing in her eyes. Together. He nodded, sure of it now in a way he hadn't been before. Together, understanding passed between them, quiet but deep as a river current. The fire crackled low, and the wolf called again, but here in this room. They had found something stronger than threats or fear. They had found each other. The deed in Ella's saddlebag might have brought them together. But Eric knew now it was more than paper and ink binding their fates. It was truth and justice, and the courage to stand against wrong no matter the cost. Looking at Ella in the fading light, he saw not an outlaw, but a woman worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. The coffee cooled in their cups as they sat together, watching the flames dance lower. Neither moved to add more wood. Some moments deserved to burn themselves out slowly, leaving only warmth and certainty behind. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the kitchen window as Eric finished his coffee. Ella stood at the mirror, pinning her dark hair neatly beneath her best hat, the one without bullet holes or trail dust. You don't have to go, Eric said quietly. No one would blame you for staying home. Ella's fingers didn't pause in their work. I won't hide, she replied, meeting his eyes in the mirror. Let them see me as I am, not some story on a wanted poster. Eric nodded, understanding but uneasy. The past week had been tense, with frequent patrols riding past the ranch. Each hoofbeat brought fresh worry that the sheriff had finally decided to act. They hitched up the wagon in silence, the familiar routine of checking straps and traces offering small comfort. The morning air held a bite that promised winter wasn't far off. Ella had left her revolver in the house, a gesture of peace that Eric hoped wouldn't prove foolish. The drive to town passed too quickly. Other wagons and riders converged on the white-painted church. families in their Sunday best, nodding stiffly as Eric helped Ella down. She held her head high, but he felt the slight tremor in her hand. Inside, the familiar scents of pine, wood, and lamp oil filled the air. The congregation parted before them like water around a stone. Whispers followed their path to a back pew, where Eric's family had sat for 20 years. Mrs. Peterson clutched her hymnal tighter. The banker's wife shifted ostentatiously away. Ella's spine was straight as a fence post, her eyes fixed forward. But Eric saw how her fingers worried the edge of her shawl, the only sign of her discomfort. The preacher rose, Bible in hand. Let us begin with the heavy door crashed open. Sheriff Avery filled the doorway, flanked by Deputies Miller and Hawkins. Their boots echoed on the wooden floor as they strode down the center aisle. Avery's hand rested on his gun belt, his face set in grim satisfaction. "Ella Hayes," he announced, voice carrying to the rafters. "You're under arrest for theft, assault on railroad agents, and resisting lawful authority." The congregation erupted in gasps and murmurs. Children craned their necks to see. Ella rose slowly, pale but composed. "This is a house of God," she said clearly. "Have you no respect? Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Avery pulled a folded paper from his vest. "I have a proper warrant this time, signed by Judge Wilson himself." Eric surged to his feet. "That judge is in the railroad's pocket. Everyone knows it." "Stay back, Callahan," Deputy Miller warned, hand on his pistol. But Eric couldn't stay silent. "The law's corrupt. They're stealing land, killing honest folks who stand in their way." His voice rose, desperate. "Are we all going to watch it happen?" The deputies moved fast. Rough hands seized Eric's arms, shoving him against a pew. His cheek pressed against smooth wood as they held him down. From the corner of his eye, he saw Avery grab Ella's wrists. She fought then, twisting like a wild thing. "The deed." "I have to shut your mouth," Avery growled, cinching rope around her wrists. "We'll find whatever you stole." The congregation watched in frozen silence. Some faces showed shock, others a vindicated righteousness. The preacher stood helpless, Bible dangling forgotten at his side. Only little Ruthie Dawson cried out, "Leave Miss Ella alone." Before her aunt hushed her, they dragged Ella toward the door, her boots scraping on the floor. Eric struggled against the deputy's grip. "This isn't justice," he shouted. "This is just might making right." No one moved to help. No one spoke up. These were his neighbors, people he'd known all his life. But they turned away, studying their hymnals or the floor. The deputies released him with a warning shove. Eric staggered up, running outside just in time to see them throw Ella into the back of a prison wagon. The impact drove a pained gasp from her lips. "Eric," she called, pressing against the iron bars. The deed, "It's in my Avery," slammed his fist against the wagon. "That's enough out of you." The driver cracked his whip. Wheels turned, carrying Ella away down the dusty street. Eric could only watch, fists clenched in helpless rage as the wagon grew smaller and smaller. Finally, it vanished around a bend, leaving nothing but settling dust and the echo of iron-shod wheels. The church bell tolled, calling the congregation back to worship. But Eric couldn't move. Everything they'd built over these weeks, trust, understanding, maybe even love, seemed to crumble like dry earth in his hands. He rode home alone, the empty wagon seat beside him an accusation. The ranch felt hollow, haunted by memories of Ella's voice, her laugh. The way she'd made this lonely place feel like home again. Night fell, finding Eric on his knees in the darkened kitchen. The same kitchen where they'd shared meals and stories, where he'd watched her gentle way with the orphan children, where he'd begun to believe in second chances. "Lord," he whispered, voice rough, "I ain't been much for praying since Sarah died. Figured you had your reasons, even if I couldn't see them. His fingers gripped the worn tablecloth. But I'm asking now, show me what to do. Show me how to make this right. Moonlight spilled through the window, touching the empty coffee cup Ella had used that morning. Her shawl still hung by the door, forgotten in their rush to church, small pieces of her, scattered through his life like seeds. She ain't what they say she is, Eric continued, words spilling out, urgent and raw. She's got a good heart, stands up for what's right, no matter the cost. He swallowed hard. I can't let them hang her for that, please. Show me the way. Only silence answered. Outside, a coyote wailed, a lonely sound that echoed Eric's own desolation. He stayed there on his knees, praying into the darkness, till his legs cramped and his voice gave out. Finally, he climbed stiffly to his feet. The house felt colder than he'd ever known it. Moving like a sleepwalker, he lit the lamp and sank into his chair. The flame cast wavering shadows on the walls, the same walls that had witnessed their quiet evenings together. Their growing trust, their shared dreams of justice. The night stretched endless before him, filled with memories of Ella's courage and the shame of watching her taken. Somewhere in town, she lay in a cell, alone with her fears. While he sat here, free, but feeling more imprisoned than ever, he had to find a way to help her. Had to prove the railroad's crimes and save her from the hangman's noose. But how? The law was against them. The town had turned its back. And time was running out. Eric bowed his head again, continuing his silent vigil. Outside, the wind mourned around the eaves. The stars wheeled slow and indifferent overhead. Morning light streamed through the county records office windows as Eric hunched over dusty ledgers. His fingers traced line after line of cramped writing, searching for truth buried in bureaucracy. The musty smell of old paper filled his nose as he turned another page. After 4 hours of searching, his tired eyes caught something. The surveyor's signature on the railroad's claim didn't match earlier documents. Fresh anger rose in Eric's chest as he found more discrepancies, dates that didn't align. Boundaries that shifted suspiciously. The clerk, a thin man named Peterson, kept glancing nervously at the door. When Eric confronted him, Peterson's shoulders slumped. "They paid us," he whispered. "Said we'd lose our jobs if we didn't play along. The railroadmen, they don't care about right or wrong." Eric's hand shook slightly as he copied the damning evidence. At the telegraph office, he spent precious dollars sending a detailed message to Judge Harrison in Denver, a man known scared for his integrity. Walking back through town, he caught fragments of conversation that chilled his blood. Hanging's too good for her. Kind, ... They'll string her up by week's end. ... The ranch house felt empty when he returned. Eric choked down cold bread at his kitchen table, spreading out the copied documents under lamplight. "Lord," he whispered, "give me strength to see this through." The courthouse buzzed with tension as morning sun filtered through tall windows. Townsfolk packed the wooden benches, their whispers echoing off the high ceiling. Boots scraped against rough floorboards as Ella was led in, iron shackles clinking with each step. Though her wrists were bound, she held her chin high. Meeting the stares of those who had judged her, Sheriff Avery unfolded a wrinkled paper. "Ella Hayes stands accused of robbery and fraud against the Western Railroad Company," he announced, his voice carrying through the hushed room in the front row. Harlan Fitch, the railroad agent, smiled coldly. His satisfaction was short-lived. "Your Honor?" Eric's voice rang out as he strode forward. "I have evidence of corruption." He presented the documents, explaining the forged signatures and shifted boundaries. Peterson, the clerk, rose shakily to confirm his testimony about the railroad's bribes. The judge studied the papers, his weathered face growing stern. "This evidence shows clear corruption," he declared. "Sheriff, you have allowed greed to corrupt justice." He turned to Ella. "Miss Hayes, You are free. The shackles fell away. Gasps and mutters filled the room as some spectators cheered while others grumbled in disappointment. Outside in the bright sunlight, Eric took Ella's hand. Their fingers intertwined, speaking what words could not. The evening sun painted golden streaks across the ranch house as Eric guided the wagon home. Before they reached the gate, neighbors' carriages lined the dusty road. The widow Peterson hurried forward with a covered dish of fresh bread. Behind her, the Andersons brought a steaming pot of stew, their eyes downcast with shame for their earlier judgment. "We were wrong about you, Miss Hayes." Martha Anderson admitted softly. 10-year-old Caleb and 7-year-old Ruthie Dawson broke free from the crowd, racing toward the wagon. "Auntie Ella," they cried, their small boots kicking up dust. Ella knelt to embrace them, her eyes bright with tears. Later, after the neighbors departed, Eric and Ella sat at the kitchen table. Lamplight danced across their faces as they shared a quiet supper. Steam rose from their cups as crickets chirped outside. "You know," Eric said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I prayed for a bride. Never thought the Lord would answer quite like this." Ella's fork paused. "And I never thought I'd find a home," she whispered, tears glazing her eyes. They stepped out onto the porch together. The air smelled sweet with recent rain, and stars sparkled overhead. Side by side, they gazed at the horizon, stretching endless and free before them. Morning sunlight spilled across the valley as Eric and Ella rode their horses toward the contested springland. The gentle clip-clop of hooves mingled with meadowlarks, trilling their morning songs. Purple and yellow wildflowers dotted the grass. Swaying in the breeze dotted the spring's edge, water bubbled crystal clear over smooth stones. Ella reached into her saddlebag and withdrew the worn deed, her brother's legacy. She pressed it into Eric's weathered hands. "This land means everything," she said softly. "But I want to build something new here. Not just guard old memories." Eric's fingers closed around both the deed and her hand. "We'll honor your brother's sacrifice," he promised. "Make a life worthy of it." Together they knelt by the spring, heads bowed. Eric's deep voice carried their prayer across the water, dedicating the land to God's purpose and justice. Ella's quiet amen echoed his own. When they returned to the ranch, neighbors waited to welcome them. Caleb and Ruthie Dawson raced forward, wrapping their arms around Ella's waist. As dusk painted the sky in violet and gold, Eric and Ella stood on their porch. Warm lamplight spilled through the window behind them. Where two lonely souls had once stood apart, now faith, justice, and love bound them together. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.